Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. I'm Kristen Sargent, Chevy Chase at Home's Member and Volunteer Programs Manager. As you may already know, Chevy Chase at Home engages adults 55 and older in social and educational programming, both in person and virtually. We also provide volunteer services to our members who need assistance to remain at home, including rides, tech support, and minor household chores. We are so glad to have you join us this afternoon for our speaker series. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. This program is being recorded for those who are not able to join us this afternoon. Your questions are welcomed. Please type them into the chat and we will get to them after we hear Marvin's introductory thoughts. Finally, I wanted to clarify that today's presentation is for educational purposes and our speaker will be sharing his point of view. Those views do not necessarily reflect the point of view of Chevy Chase at Home. With that, Susan Post, who is a member of Chevy Chase at Home's Board of Directors and co-chair of our Speakers Committee, is going to introduce our speaker, Marvin Kalb, and moderate today's talk. So I will turn it over to Susan. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. It's my honor to welcome Marvin Kalb, a journalist who spent 30 years as an award-winning reporter for CBS and NBC News. At NBC, he served as chief diplomatic correspondent and host of Meet the Press. And for 28 years, he produced the Kalb Report, which we all remember well and which had its final airing only last year. Marvin spent 5 years living in Russia and is the author of numerous books on Russia, the press, Trump, and threats to democracy. So it's with great pleasure and appreciation that I welcome Marvin Kalb. Marvin, where would you like to start?
In heaven. Thank you very much, Susan. Very kind introduction. I'm grateful for it. I love the idea of meeting my neighbors. Some of them probably I never met before. I mean, when I walk down Oxford Street, I occasionally meet one or two, but that's it. So here you all are, and I'm grateful for that. And thank you for the invitation to speak today. The subject is awesome, democracy. And what I would like to do right from the beginning is break it down into two parts and then expand it. The first part is a date. Today, February 22nd. 2 years ago, I'm sure most of you remember, Vladimir Putin sent the Russian army across a national border and invaded Ukraine, launching what was probably and is probably the largest, most destructive war fought on the European continent since World War II. The losses are humongous. At this particular point, so far, the Russians have lost or have wounded 500,000 people, and the Ukrainians 350,000 people. Bearing in mind, please, that Ukraine is 1/3 the size of Russia. The battle at this point is in a stalemate. But on the military side, the Russians appear to be more winning than losing. But it's still, according to the experts, a stalemate. The second point, just to launch us today, is last Friday, a very significant figure died. Or put another way, we learned about the death of a very significant figure, Alexei Navalny, who was the leader of what could be called the unofficial political opposition in Russia. And the two ideas coming together, the Ukraine war and Navalny's death, compel me to change somewhat the focus of what it is that I wanted to talk about. Originally, what I had in mind was the danger to American democracy caused by Donald Trump. That is an issue which we can pick up in the Q&A if you like. But my thought at this point is to focus on Russia in a somewhat different way. I think most of us see Russia today in a proper way. It is an aggressive nation. It is run by a man who is a flat-out dictator. At this point, 20 plus years into Putin's reign, we know that he went from somebody who was a KGB operative, a successful one. He worked in East Germany, came back and had a very quick ascendancy into the very top ranks of the Russian political system. And when he took over in the year 2000, for a couple of years, you may remember, he and George Bush II could look at each other and each claim that they saw the other's soul. That was, of course, pure political nonsense. And starting in about 2007, Putin began to indicate in a public way his desire to accumulate more and more power, which he has succeeded in doing, to the point where he is in charge not only of the Russian military, but in addition, something which is often ignored, there is a force called the National Guard. 300,000 people are in the National Guard. It is there for one purpose, that is to keep Putin in power. It is spread out all over the country. If there is a strike that they want shut down, which they do, they shut it down. If there is a demonstration in Vladivostok and Putin doesn't like it, it is shut down. That is the function of the National Guard. That is in addition to the established Russian military. This is very much, it has become a police state. It is dark. It is foreboding. I read this morning, as a matter of fact, an article written by a very prominent Russian writer, contemporary, who says that with the death of Navalny, the country has lost its life. I'm not sure that's right. I think it's overstated. But the fact is, Navalny touched the lives of many, many people. And with his death, it is possible to imagine so many people, Russians, simply lost, wandering around, not knowing how they can attach themselves to a goal, to an idea, something that they regard as important to them. Their nationality, their religion, their politics, whatever it happens to be, for many people today in Russia, they have no inspiration. Everything is dark. And what I want to talk about a little bit is a different Russia. It's not for me to do at all, but to the degree that I have 2 ounces of influence here in this room, I just want to say that I think there is a different Russia. And we all ought to be aware of the fact that though we are submerged in a Putinized Russia, which is so grim and aggressive, there is also a different Russia. Now, I would like to take you all back just several decades. And as I look around the room, so to speak, I have a feeling that many of you are with me on this. You will remember another Russian leader called Nikita Khrushchev. I lived in Russia during most of the Khrushchev era. He took power essentially in 1954-5, but that followed the death of Stalin in March of 1953. Stalin had been a brutal dictator for 29 years. And so the entire country was completely submerged in Stalinism. And that was a tough place to be. And Khrushchev, who was one of the closest allies of Stalin, had the guts, and I'm going to use that word a couple of times, had the guts on February 24th, 1956, before a meeting of the 20th Party Congress to take on the legend of Stalin and essentially take the first steps towards undermining and ultimately destroying the legend of Joseph Stalin. And what Khrushchev did was to replace that Stalinist Russia with a new kind of Russia. It was different then, and it is very different now. The Russia then of Nikita Khrushchev was a Russia, still a dictatorship, but a Russia of hope. Khrushchev had in mind reforming a system that in retrospect could not be reformed. The communist system was a very backward, hideous, and in my judgment, destructive system, both politically and economically. Khrushchev was a devout communist, but he still had in mind that somehow you can take the country and the system and reform it and make it better. And so we put hope into the Russian people and promised them in 1961, you got to listen to that. In 1961, he promised them that by 1980, 19 years ahead, he was going to make sure that every Russian had a rent-free apartment. Every Russian had a free education. Every Russian had a free medical service. Everything was free and wonderful. And he then turned specifically in a very famous bit of television in Russia then, he turned to a woman in her 80s and said, "Madam, what's your name?" She gave her name. And he said, "You, now on, you are going to have 9 free, beautiful dresses delivered to your home every year." Then he turned to her husband and said, "How old are you?" He said, 84. "Great." He said, "You're going to have, listen, 27 new suits delivered." It was all nonsense. And the Russian people knew it was nonsense, but they loved the idea of something good coming down the road. At the same time as Khrushchev had the recklessness, and in my judgment, nearsighted and stupidity, to take action leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the entire world to the edge of a nuclear war. Also built the Berlin Wall, August 13th, 1961, bringing the world again dangerously close to conflict. As he was doing this, he also was able to sell the Russian people on the future and, with President Kennedy, engage not only in confrontation, but in cooperation, and establish one of the most active cultural exchange programs between the two countries. As the Bolshoi Ballet went to New York and then traveled the country, so the New York City Ballet went to Moscow. Jan Pierce went there and sang, and I can tell you that the streets were jammed to listen to an American star singing. Isaac Stern brought his fiddle to Moscow and enchanted the people because Isaac also spoke Russian. So you have the flow of Americans into Russia, and by the way, many American students. And you had this sense of an opening up, and American kids coming in to Moscow, Russian students up at Harvard. It was an amazing openness. And yet, he was a communist dictator. And he was trying to do both things. And he was trying, in some way or another, to make it a better world. He failed utterly. He was kicked out of power on October 15th, 1964, and sent off to live by himself and his family in a suburb of Moscow. He was not overly depressed, however, because he turned to his son, Sergei, and said at this point, "Don't be too unhappy, Sergei. Until Nikita Khrushchev, they would have taken the leader of Russia and killed him when they got rid of him. Now we have made huge progress. I am alive, and I have a house, and I live in the suburbs. Those are my words, but they are the equivalent of what he was given. So there was a change, and it was a big change. And he launched, with President Kennedy, the first disarmament agreement, June 1963, the American University speech in which Kennedy opened up America to the opportunity for a ban on atmospheric nuclear testing and underwater nuclear testing, underground, excuse me, nuclear testing. And Khrushchev fought it and launched this effort, which led under President Nixon to very significant arms control agreements. So there was that different Russia that you could, even in its communist form, you could still deal with. We do not have that today. Today, it is dramatically different. There are no exchange students going back and forth. There are no artists going back and forth. There is no negotiation on anything between the two countries. We are in a deep deadlock. And both countries are stuffed with nuclear weapons. Would Putin use a nuclear weapon? No one knows that, and I pray no one ever knows that. But it is a question, and it is a question of legitimate concern, I think, to all of us. And one of the reasons that I am in a somewhat depressed state at the moment is that when I look around this country and try to find leadership that thinks big, I'm sort of stumped, although I do accept President Biden's efforts in the past to try to get on with Putin and with Russia, but he has hardened his policy justifiably, I rush to add, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I look around at the American political countryside, and I see one figure out there larger than any other. And he was once a president. He isn't at the moment, but he would like to be once again. And I try to figure out to myself before I would articulate it to others or write it down, put it in a book. What is happening right now in this country to meet the challenges that clearly as a nation we face? I see a country that has changed. I see a world that has changed. Putin, a dictator, Xi in China, population of 1.4 billion people, dictator. Iran, dictatorial. India tilting toward an authoritarian state. Western Europe, in Italy, there is a right-wing government in power today. Still not nutty, but a right-wing government. France, 39% of the French people voting for a right-wing government in the last election, and she is now favored, according to the polls, in the next election to beat Macron and to bring a rightist government into France. So there is a movement to the right all over the world. Freedom House here in Washington has done some extraordinary reporting on what is happening globally to the concept of democracy. And I would like to share with you a story about a man I have a feeling you all remember, Edward R. Murrow. Murrow hired me at CBS in 1957. And until I went to Moscow for CBS in 1960, in that 3-year period, I was in New York most of the time and had an opportunity to meet and talk to Murrow at some length. Murrow was a man who, as I'm sure many of you remember, he'd always walk around with a cigarette and he'd always be sort of depressed. And when he walked into the newsroom, his shoulders were hunched over and the cigarette and a dark look in his face. And it was something awful had happened. And I would say, Mr. Murrow, because I called him that, everybody else called him Ed. Mr. Murrow, is anything I can do? He said, no. He said, I keep thinking of Germany. Talking to you about the conversations in the late 1950s. And Murrow told me about stories that were very much on his mind way after the end of World War II. Before that war began, starting in about 1935, Murrow went on a regular basis to Western Europe to try to establish cultural exchanges, news exchanges. He wasn't as yet even a journalist, but he did work for CBS, and he was a good-looking guy, and he had a nice voice, and he was curious, and he went around talking to people. He went all over Western Europe, and in Germany, in Berlin, he met a wonderful family, and he and this family became very close. And whenever Murrow was in Berlin, he would always stop, knock at the door, give them a call, whatever. They would go to a concert, they would have dinner. They would enjoy it very much. They loved each other's company. Murrow then had to do a number of other things, and he returned in 1938 and went to Berlin in the early fall of 1938. And he called, and the father was there, invited Murrow in, and when the door opened and Murrow looked at him, he was in a Nazi uniform. And Murrow was taken aback for a moment, but did go in, and thinking that nothing really had changed, began to talk to him in the way he did 2 or 3 years before. Only he found a total change in the man. The man was now expressing Nazi thoughts, violently anti-Semitic, determined to conquer, to take over, to speak aggressively about France and Italy and Eastern Europe and Russia. He began to outline, in other words, for Murrow, the Nazi vision of World War II. Murrow was stunned. And when I talked to him almost 20 years later, and he would tell me a story like this, it was because he kept wondering, how is it possible for a modern, highly civilized country like Germany, the arts, music, literature, how could a country like that change so dramatically, so quickly? And Murrow never had an answer to that question. A question he kept asking himself, but never had an answer, because there was perhaps no answer. It happened. And so in 2017, jumping ahead a bit, please, I hope I'm not being too confusing. In 2017, 3 weeks after Donald Trump became president of the United States, I was doing a talk at the Cosmos Club one night about the American press. And a dear friend of mine ran in and told me just before I was called on to talk, he said, "Have you heard what the president just said?" "Nope." "What?" He said, "Well, you ought to put it in your speech because he's just called the press the enemy of the people." I said, "You're kidding." He said, "No, no." He said, "That is exactly what he has called them. And I think you ought to put it in your speech." I said, "I sure will." And in the 2 or 3 minutes I had before, I was thinking that phrase, enemy of the people, where did that come from? And I sort of knew it. Maybe not at the time, but I picked it up very quickly. The phrase goes way back to Roman times. But in terms of political meaning, it acquired that meaning during the French Revolution. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, a journalist named Mussolini in Italy used the expression enemy of the people, claiming that when he took power, when the fascists took power in Italy, the first target would be the media. They didn't use that word then, the press. Why? Because the press had to be contained. Once you contain the press, you contain the message. Once you contain the message, you contain your ability to function, to do anything that you wanted to do. After Mussolini, the next guy who used that expression repeatedly, excuse me, was Hitler. He came to power in 1933 and almost immediately knocked the press out of line. By 1938, when Murrow came back to Germany, he already saw that the press was simply the mouthpiece of fascism. And then Stalin thought that was a great expression too, and so he picked it up. And the press in the Soviet Union became the mouthpiece of the Communist Party. The number two newspapers in Russia, at that time, they're still around, but they're a joke now. One of them was Pravda, excuse me, the Russian word for truth. The other newspaper is Izvestia, the Russian word for news. Skeptical Russians always said there was no truth in Pravda and there was no news in Izvestia. Journalism was meaningless, except as an instrument of propaganda. Likewise in China. Why in God's name, I kept thinking, why would an American president use that expression? What was in his mind? Was he aware of the history of that expression? Who put it in his head? And it turned out it was not his expression at all. He picked it up from Fox. On Fox, there was a commentator who said that the press in America was the enemy of the people because it criticized Trump. So that made it an enemy. Trump liked that idea, immediately picked it up. And by the way, it is unbelievably popular and successful in this country today. More than 50% of the American people, believe it or not, think of the press as an unreliable, totally wacko industry which makes things up. It's fake news. That expression again, Trump's contribution, fake news. Now I'm starting this Trump thing conversation on the press issue because I go back to something Murrow said, and I'm going to try to pull this all together in a moment. Murrow said there are two functional institutions in any democracy that must be maintained for democracy to survive. One of them was the legal system. He referred to it as sacrosanct, that the Supreme Court, the courts in a democracy, had to be respected and honored because they didn't take sides. The other thing he said was the press. that had to be, above it all, honest, forthright. What is it that we see today in this wonderful country, still a wonderful country? Is a press that is divided, essentially shattered. There's a Fox world and there's a New York Times world. And even the New York Times is under considerable economic pressures right now. And as far as the legal system is concerned, is there anyone in this country who truly believes that the Supreme Court is objective today? I don't think so. The Supreme Court has lost its legitimacy. And yet it's what we have. Trump also tells you what he is going to do, little things that I noticed in the paper today. If he were to come back into power, setting up camps for people slipping across the border. He would take them by the thousands and put them into camps, like the camps that we had in this country for Japanese in World War II. My summary here is there are danger spots around us politically, and we ought to be smart enough to spot them and to take action to stop them. Because we still remain in this country the #1 country in the world, the leader of what might be the democratic free parts of this world. And without us, the world is shot. That's my opinion. And it is only an opinion. With us, there's a chance for democracy to survive. That's enough for me. So maybe you guys have some questions, and I would be more than happy to try to answer them.
Well, I wonder, Marvin, how do you think we got to Trump? How did this country become so bifurcated that someone like Trump could become its president? And I'm not talking about issues of the electrical college. Yeah, the electoral college. But do you have a sense of what happened among the populace that brought us to this point?
I do. I've studied this question at some length. The answer goes back to two events in the 1970s. One was the tail end of the Vietnam War, and the other was Watergate. In the Vietnam War, there was the perception not only that the press lost the war for us, but that America, can you believe it, lost a war. And there were many people in this country who simply would not accept it. And that, in my mind, is the heartbeat of the MAGA Republican movement today. The second is that a Republican president was brought down by what? By the press, by the Washington Post. And therefore, if the press can bring down a Republican president and we can lose a war, that set in motion the currents that led to the rise of what we now call MAGA Republicanism and the rise of a cunning, shrewd political animal, someone like Trump, who can recognize what's going on, sees those fissures in American society, and gain enough support to win. That's the way he won the first time. And at this particular point, he is in the lead with certain polls, but then there's a recent poll last night that had Biden back in the lead. So you can't really go with polls, but you can say that Trump represents another very significant tilting toward authoritarianism point of view. We are, bottom line, in a challenged democracy at this point. We still have it, but it's a challenged democratic system.
How do you think events in other parts of the world, such as the Ukraine war, the death of Alexei Navalny, the Israeli-Gaza war, affect the future of democracy, both here and around the world?
Well, I've touched on the war,
Yeah.
Navalny, but around the world, there is definitely a move to the right. What is happening in America is consistent with that move. But what I was trying to say at the end of my talk was that it is still within the power of the United States to stop that movement, or at least put obstacles in the way of that movement and redirect it back toward the democratic impulse of the world. And I think it is still possible, but it's going to be difficult, but it is still possible.
Do you think I guess I'm curious about what has led to this swing to the right in so many areas of the world. Is it economic issues? Is it cultural clashes?
I think for the most part, you have the rise of China as a global power affects a great deal economically, politically. The rise of a new technology, which has totally transformed our lives. I'm looking at a new computer set that I just got. This is so important to me as a writer. I need this. In the old days, I had my marvelous Olivetti typewriter, and I was in seventh heaven with that, but now that's no good. So to be part of today's world, I have to join that. And then another point here, Susan, which is key, is the rise of social media. The rise of social media has diminished the quality of the exchange of ideas, the exchange of hard news. What is hard news today? That seeks a definition. It's not that easy to find. The rise of social media is profoundly important on the political side, on the economic side, the social side, ripping this country to pieces. And you do that along the lines of social media. I hope if you invite me back in a couple of years, we'll talk more about the rise and impact of social media, but that's crucial, absolutely crucial.
There's some interesting questions in the chat. And one is about the press's coverage of the presidential race and Biden's age, and the report that came out by her. It's
Right.
sort of a scary sign, people.
Right. Okay, I can tell you, I can give you an old reporter's anguish on that particular story. Number one, if we lived in an ideal world and not the world of the journalism that we have today, there is a lot of great journalism that goes on. But the social media, the splitting of the journalistic world into Fox and non-Fox, all of that stuff has dramatically changed the ways in which news is presented to the American people. Right now, if journalists can attach themselves to an issue like the president's age, that's considered juicy. That's considered front page. It was an interesting incident just last night, as a matter of fact. I noticed on the news that Biden approached a group of reporters at the White House. He was going to board a plane and fly out to California. And the reporters' questions ranged from, should Gavin get himself ready now?
Right.
What is your view? And Biden clearly, he volunteered that he had talked about sanctions, additional sanctions against the Russians because of Navalny's death. I don't, this is not a personal comment. Please believe me when I say that. When I was in journalism, when Ted Koppel was in journalism, when my dear brother Bernie Kalb was in journalism, we would have asked him about Russia. We would have asked him about issues of substance, about what it is that presidents do for a living. But that is not what is of interest to the reporter today. Again, not all reporters, but those that get on the air, those that you see on the nightly news. Speaking of the nightly news, I, at the moment, sort of have given up watching them, the 3 nightly news programs, because they're so radically different from the programs that Bernie and I and Ted and others did. We tried very hard, and this goes right back to Murrow, by the way, because I know exactly where I got this thought. Murrow would always say, I cannot tell the American people what to be interested in. They have to make up their own minds. And they're an intelligent people, so they will make up their own minds. I can only give them the news that I think is important. And so, in a current context, if I, Marvin, think what is important is what's going on in Russia, our economic connections with Western Europe, what is going on in China now, does the fall in the Chinese economy have an impact on the American economy? All of these issues, in my judgment, must be addressed. And vaguely they are, but not nearly enough. And so the press still has a long way to go to live up to the kind of responsibility I think that it has. Because when you ask yourself, where do you get the news from? You get it from the press. You get it from the local news. You get it from picking up the Post. That's where you get it from. So if they don't give it to you straight, you're at a loss.
So last night, Lawrence O'Donnell presented a monologue on how what we see of Biden or any other president in the past is his speeches, his talking to the press, and what we don't see is any of the governing of the country. We don't see Biden in the Oval Office doing his job, which O'Donnell thinks he's doing very well. We don't, for the most part, see the Supreme Court at work or Congress at work. So how does the press even cover this? How do they get the information on the governing, on Biden's governing, that they need to have to keep us well informed?
Okay, well, the problem here, with all due respect to Lawrence O'Donnell, the problem here is not just the press. The White House does not let the press into most substantive discussions because they're making decisions. They don't want the public to know who is making the decision, how the decision is made. They just want the public to know that the president made the decision, and here he is telling you all about it. So the White House is the television producer of the news presentation. You say, talk about Capitol Hill. Reporters can run around there and they bump into a lot of senators and congressmen, and they want their point of view out. And so they will talk to the press. So it's easier to cover Capitol Hill. The White House, you're covering a formal presentation produced by the White House. So it becomes the extra responsibility of the press to dig behind what it is that they give you. And it is possible. I was just writing this last night for something. It is possible. You ask questions, you dig. There are people at the State Department and the White House, Capitol Hill, the Pentagon, who are there to answer your questions. And even if they have other jobs, they'll talk to you. If they see that you are a responsible reporter, they want their point of view out also. So they'll talk to you, but you have to dig for the information. It's not just presented to you. So O'Donnell, can talk about it being just the fault of the press. No, partly the fault, but equally the fault of the government for hiding the process from the public.
That's what he's saying, yeah. You mentioned that one of the hallmarks of a democracy was a strong judicial system. And I'm thinking about the current Supreme Court and its leanings and some of its recent rulings, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and yesterday, as we found out, embryos are now children. Do you want to go into issues of the judicial system any more deeply, or?
That is something, Susan, that I am not all that equipped to do. I'm not a lawyer. I know about the system pretty much what we all know. We read it and learn from very good writers like Ruth Marcus at the Post. There are wonderful reporters doing terrific work and certainly helping people like me out to try to keep up with what's happening around the world. Journalists, the whole First Amendment business, when you think about this, the people who wrote the Constitution to the governing structure of this country, what was the first thing they wrote? The First Amendment. The First Amendment contains the phrases that you cannot control, you cannot make laws governing religion, demonstrations, and the press and the freedom to speak your mind. Why is it that in Russia today, anybody who doesn't say a word, just puts a flower down in front of a monument, not of Navalny, a national monument to soldiers in general, that person, if young, having just put the flower down at that monument, can be sent into the army immediately. That is a punishment today in Russia. In other words, not even arrested and put into prison.
Mm-hmm.
Worse, we're going to send you to the front lines. This battle recently in Avdiivka, in the Donetsk region of Ukraine, about 1,000 Ukrainians were left behind because the Russians came in and sort of wiped them out. The Russians had the kind of equipment to do the job. They had ammunition and the Ukrainians had run out. So the Ukrainians couldn't fight. So what happens at that time? 1,000 of the Ukrainians are picked up by the Russians. And if my information is right, more than 10,000 Ukrainians were either wounded or killed in that battle over the last couple of months. Was the battle of any strategic value? In other words, did the fall of this city mean that the Ukrainians have lost the war? No. Did it mean that the Russians have won the war? No. But it is a key battle because there's going to be an election in Russia next month. Putin is running against himself. So obviously he's winning. Question. How large a percentage of the vote is Putin supposed to get? Well, if only pro-Putin people vote, he's going to get 99.9% of the vote. And that's the way it's going to be reported. And the reporter can say, the government today announced that 99.9% of the Russian vote went to Putin, indicating a phenomenal success. No, it doesn't. But that is what the Russian people are going to get. And they're going, I would say, I don't remember because I haven't looked at this in the last couple of months. But when I did look at it last, something like 80 to 90% of the Russian people get all of their news, everything that they know about their own country and the world from Moscow television. And Moscow television is a 100% propaganda organ of the Russian government. So they know only what the government tells them. So the press is that, it is a propaganda organ on one side, and it is an effort by reporters on this side to find out either what Biden truly is doing as a president or how he is feeling at age 81. I mean, hell, I'm in my 90s. And I still think my head is working. So age has to do with the individual, his capacity, her capacity. You know, we're people and not statistics, but that's going to get lost.
Can I interrupt and ask something? You said that we're in a dangerous phase and we need to take action. What kind of action do you see that people like us can take?
I can tell you one thing. The minute I said that, I knew I had said the wrong thing. That's an excellent question, because I am not in it. I'm truly, honestly, I am not in a position just as a citizen to say, this is what you guys ought to do. I know what I can do. I know that I can write what I feel. I know that I can say what I think. I know that this country will still publish me and listen to me. That is what I can do. And I can say what I think is going on. You have to make up your own mind. But I mean, one thing obviously you can do, what everybody does, is you chip in some money to the people who need it. And you make sure that you and all of your friends and family vote. Those are the good things that you can do. And another thing is not only you and your family, but your friends. Who among your friends is sort of sitting back and saying, oh, hell, there's nothing I can do about it. Trump is going to win, or Biden's going to win, or they're both old men, or who cares what they think? What about, have you sat in on some meetings with young people where they tell you how uninterested they are in the politics of this country? That's heartbreaking.
Really?
That's heartbreaking.
And you see that?
I'm sorry?
You see that among young people?
Yes. Yes. Now you can throw a question at me immediately. Marvin, in the 1940s or 50s, were you absorbed and blah, blah, blah? Not as much as I should have been. No, but certainly I knew what the heck was going on. And I didn't have an internet then. But what I had in New York City was about 15 different newspapers.
Yeah.
I couldn't afford to buy more than one, but they were all over the place. You could stand in front of a kiosk and just look at the headlines. You got a sense in those days of the different points of view. They shouted at you. Listen to me. Look at me. Today, what shouts out at you, again, age, a romance having to do with the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
I mean, they're wonderful stories, but it isn't the whole world. There's an awful lot going on, and we ought to be more serious about it.
There is. Do you have time for one or two last questions? Marvin?
Hmm.
Okay to ask one or two last questions?
Oh, no, I mean, if you
Which
have anything, go
You
ahead.
may or may not feel okay to answer, but someone is asking, how large a role do you think white men feeling threatened by the change in the racial composition of the US is behind MAGA?
It's a very fundamental point. There's no question that is part of the case. Look, when Barack Obama became president, I don't know about you, personal comment, I was delighted, absolutely delighted. At the very same time, I said to friends and said on air, there are going to be an awful lot of white people who are going to ask themselves, how come a black guy is now sleeping in Lincoln's bed? Unacceptable. We're going to have to stop that. And I knew at that time in my gut that there will be a rise of white dissatisfaction with Obama being president of the United States. So the answer is very much yes, there's a direct connection.
Okay. I think we're good. Do you want to say anything about the Israeli-Gaza war, or should we omit that? Do you think it has anything to do with people's sense of liberalism, conservatism, the future
Yes.
of democracy
Yeah.
in this country?
There are very many ways of addressing that issue. We would need another hour to get into
Yeah.
it, of course. However, the part of the problem that is particularly disturbing to me, as someone who was associated with a great university, and I think Harvard remains a great university, but it's in trouble now. And it's in trouble because there is a point of view that is out there that in the Middle East today, there's the colonizer and the colonized. And the Palestinians have successfully placed themselves within the world of the colonized, meaning the oppressed. And the Israelis, white, although far from it that they're all white, but anyway, that the Israelis are the colonizers and therefore the oppressors. And if you are young and not adequately informed about events in the Middle East, you can be swept up in the idea that the Israelis, as the colonizer, obviously is the pressing force and ought to be opposed. And so you get a lot of young people today who say Biden's support of Israel, although it's very tempered support, but nevertheless support, is a bad thing, and I'm not going to vote for Biden anymore. So you have a feeling out there, according to the polls, that young people are not going to vote for Biden. So are they going to vote for Trump? What does he represent? Something fabulous. So there is that aspect of it, which is extremely disturbing to me, and the impact that the war has had on the university, profoundly disturbing and unfair. But nevertheless, you don't get paid to be fair. One day we'll talk more about the Middle East.
Okay, well, we cannot thank you enough, Marvin. This has been a fascinating program. I think you've widened our views of many issues in the world, the future of democracy and the importance of youth and their views of things. I've noticed you mentioned young people numerous times, and I think sometimes those of us who are members of Chevy Chase at Home are not the young generation. We may forget sometimes to put ourselves in their place and see the world through their eyes. So thank you so much for your participation today and for your wonderful response to questions and broadening our view of how we approach the issues of democracy here and around the world.
Let me just thank you for the opportunity. I have enjoyed it, and it's always a pleasure to know that there are such nice neighbors around. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Marvin. And thanks to all of you for joining Chevy Chase at Home today for our speaker series. Hope everyone has a good rest of your day.
Thank you.